Hi. This mess of cables is playing generative music, a term coined by Brian Eno to describe music that is always different and changing, generated by a system, but led by creative guidelines, rather than typical music which follows a set of predetermined notes. In this video, we'll look at a few generative tools and techniques, both in modular, but also for Ableton Live, standalone hardware, in VCV Rack, and even an iPad app or two. The idea isn't for computers to generate music on their own, so don't worry, AI isn't taking over yet, but rather to take ideas you set and help you expand on existing melodies, harmonies, timbres, and rhythms, as well as inspire you to come up with new ones. Let's get started. I'll start with the desktop, and the first technique I'll look at is simple randomization, which isn't the only generative technique, but is certainly very useful. One of the easiest way to liven up a sound or a beat is to apply randomization to one of its parameters. Let's take, for example, this simple loop. It gets quite boring and monotonous rather quickly. But if I go ahead and apply a random LFO to it, let's say I'll choose random and then apply that to velocity, or to sustain in this case. Let's see what happens now. And I'll increase the rate to match the tempo. Right? And as we play with these parameters, right, we can get a much more interesting groove out of a rather simple pattern. So I think you get the idea. We didn't set the levels for the hi-hats in this loop, but we set random boundaries within our creative control that make it a lot more interesting. Let's take a look at another example, this time applying randomness to pitch. What I have here is a simple one-note loop. But I have a few MIDI effects that I can apply to it. The first is randomness. This is kind of like sample and hold only to pitch. And unless you speak Droid, these are not the notes you're looking for. However, if I try and force these random notes into a scale, it could sound a lot more musical and compelling, and as I change that over time, we can start to make up melodies, maybe decrease chants a little bit, and gain melodic ideas from randomness forced into a scale. Quantizers do the same thing on the Eurorack side. Now, Harmonaig here from Instruo is a really interesting quantizer because it can also create 4-note chords out of one voltage input. You can either connect these 4 notes to 4 oscillators to create chords, or like I'm doing here, arpeggiate the 4 notes with a switch like Boss Bow Tie. So let's get this going. I'll take the pitch output from Boss Bow Tie, plug it into rings, and get Glock going. Now what we're doing here is arpeggiating through these 4 notes and playing a chord with the root at F in this case. I could change it. This module also lets you play around with different inversions and different voicings. Now, if you can imagine modulating all of these, it also lets you determine the chord type. So this is a major 7th, but I can also go for, say, minor 7th. If you can imagine modulating or sequencing all these over time, you can create a really nice generative sequence just by setting a root note and then messing around with these modulations. Let's move on to another idea. It could be actually quite liberating to play a keyboard expressively and emotionally without worrying about whether the next note you play will be in scale or not. So for example, I've got the KeyStep here set to arpeggiate, and if I just smash a random group of notes, it doesn't sound so great, right? But if I go ahead and force those notes into a scale, right, it becomes more interesting because it takes these notes I'm smashing and makes them play something in the scale I chose. And if I choose a different one, let's say a Euler-Fokker scale, which means when I go ahead and smash notes now, it could sound a lot more interesting. And it sort of lets you approach a keyboard or a sequencer with more the feeling of what you want to play rather than the actual notes that you play. So I can just blindly hit notes and maybe something nice will come out. Another potentially interesting way to create melodies using a scaler or a quantizer is to take a modulating waveform, whether it's a simple LFO or a complex waveform, and sample and hold bits of that and play those bits through a quantizer. So for example, I'll take a stochastic or random envelope generated by the 506 here, plug that into Instruo. Right, and now we have an envelope where the attack and the decay, or the rise and fall, are generated randomly every loop. And every time that attack decay envelope hits another note in the quantizer, rings will play that note. And I have an arpeggiated pattern quantized simply by feeding an envelope into a quantizer. Now, I could change, say, the amplitude of that envelope or the offset to play different notes. Right? Or move it at different rates, maybe go faster or slower. I could pass this waveform through a triggered sample and hold module to sample specific notes at specific times. But I think you get the idea how even a simple attack decay envelope can be a source of melody. Now, applying an envelope to a scaler or even sending random notes to be quantized can get a little bit repetitive even though it's random, as odd as that might sound. An interesting way of controlling chaos is the Turing Machine, a concept invented by Tom Whitwell and inspired by the work of Alan Turing, implemented in a broad range of software and hardware instruments. There's a Turing Machine Max4Live script sold by a company called Encoder Audio, and there's a reactor module as well. I'll link to those below. And aside from the actual Turing Machine module, the algorithm is embedded in other modules such as Marbles and Ornament and Crime. A cool way to show you visually how a Turing machine works is in Pigments by Arturia. They recently implemented a little Turing machine as a modulation source in their software. So the basic sound that I'm going to use is this patch, right? I play a note and I get that pitch back. Now I can take this Turing machine as a modulation source and apply it to any destination that I want. Let's choose, for example, the coarse pitch parameter, right? And I'll set it to go, say, all the way up here. And now if I hit this note, I'll get random pitches. Now, that doesn't sound too great, so let me quantize it. This chord's fine. Right, now the way a Turing machine works is this. There's a pattern that has a certain length, and you can determine that in the Turing machine. Let's take a short length, just for demonstration purposes. And at its core, you can just play a fixed pattern based on random samples that went into it before. But as I turn this flip knob clockwise, it'll start introducing new notes every now and then to the pattern. And if I turn the flip knob to 50%, it'll just introduce random notes every time. So the idea is to sort of wait for or be lucky and get a pattern that you like, and then either lock it, and if I don't like it, maybe bring in some other notes. Okay, this is cool. So now I got a Turing machine to inspire a new melody based on a quantization that I set. And I can just stick with that and go with it, or if I don't like it, change it a bit every now and then. Okay. And another option is, as I turn this flip knob clockwise, then the loop will start looping onto itself, but inverting every time, sort of like a Mobius loop. And this is a 4-note loop, which is 8 notes long once flipped. I can change its length, obviously, introduce randomness back again, maybe reduce the modulation depth a bit, go into here. Because it's going too high. Okay. So just to summarize, there are two core parameters to Turing machines, the length of the loop and the probability that it will change in the next step. Turing machines don't have to be applied just to notes, they can be applied to any parameter to generate rhythmic effects. So for example, this is my core note. I can say apply a Turing machine to the filter cutoff, and same as before, I can choose to lock in a pattern if I like it, and get a certain rhythmic result. Change the length if I want, and not modulate it, but just change the length. Right. If I like this pattern, I'm good to go. And if not, I can start changing it. Either gradually or all the time. And of course, flip works here as well. I'll show you how the Turing machine in Ornament and Crime works a little bit later as I walk you through the intro patch to this video. Okay, so Turing machines are really nice generative modulation sources, but certainly not the only ones. You can create your own generative mod sources by combining several modulators together using a simple DC coupled mixer, and then introducing random parameters to those modulators. Let me explain. So I've got a simple sine wave LFO coming out of Harmonaig here, and I'll put it on the scope. And I've got envelopes coming out of the 506 here. Let's take a look at those. Right, and they've got their relative speeds. I can change that. I can change the shape if I want. And maybe make it even faster. Right, now you'll notice that the attack and decay parameters of this envelope are changing, and the way that the 506 works is that it has minimum and maximum values for the rise and for the fall, and as I play around with those, the attack and decay, or the rise and the fall of the envelopes it's generating, will change every cycle. Now if I take these two and feed them into the mixer, so one LFO out, say into input number 1, and then second envelope out into input number 2, I now have a randomized attack decay envelope riding a sine wave. Now what that sounds like through a quantizer is anyone's guess. But it's something, and it's something you might want to play with and change its rate. Or if you wanted a more steady beat, you could apply a sample and hold to this newly created waveform and reduce chaos a bit. Now, I actually used this idea in a slightly saner way to shift the arpeggiating pattern in the patch at the beginning of this video. More on that in the patch walkthrough later. Now, in that patch, I use another useful generative tool, which is the sequential switch, or a CV switch like the Boss bow tie here. The idea is quite simple. You feed in multiple inputs, and only one can come out depending on voltage levels determined here, or you have one source distributed to 4 separate places wherever you want, again, based on voltage levels going in. I want to just take a minute to talk about musical modes in generative music. If you've set your pattern in motion and you're happy with it, then great. But what you might find is that even though you selected a scale or a mode, feeding a Turing machine or a complex LFO into it doesn't quite do the job of making you feel like you're in the mode you're looking for. Let me explain. As you may know, musical modes are often associated with different feelings. For example, major is considered happy, minor a little bit sad, and say Phrygian sounds oriental. Now, what you may have noticed is as I played these modes in their degree relative to C, I only used the white keys, which means that if you're just sending random sample and hold values to white keys, you're not going to get a particular scale. You're not going to get the feeling you want. So far be it from me to tell you how to create your music, but if you want to get the feeling of these modes, you'll need to either anchor your melody or select fewer notes or create a bass line with a root note of the mode, or limit your notes to play chords of selected modes and then move through those chords rather than just randomly playing all the notes in a particular mode. I refer again back to the patch I played in the beginning of this video. I stuck to a few bass notes and played chord arpeggios, which gave it that certain feeling of a particular mode. Now, obviously, I had Harmonaig to help me with selecting the specific notes that I wanted and creating chords out of them in the scale that I selected. There are other Eurorack modules that will also let you limit your note choices and not just play semitones or even not just play all the notes of a scale. Other non-Eurorack options to enforce modes on sequences or random notes are Noodler from Conductive Labs, which I reviewed a couple of weeks ago, and there's also an app called Polyphase for the iPad, which lets you create 4 lanes of random note generators, but then lock them into modes or chords that you like. I'll link to those below, and if you know of any other or want to recommend other options, please leave a comment below. Now, once you've settled on the way you want to generate notes, another way to introduce variety into your music or to expand on an idea is to keep the melody intact but vary the rhythm. Now, this can be anything from simply adding rests and ties to your note triggers so that they don't play in a single boring note per beat rhythm, all the way to introducing various degrees of randomness to when notes or beats in a sequence are triggered. Okay, let's move on. A problem you may find with randomly generated notes or rhythms is that, depending on your taste, they might sound too chaotic. If that's the case, consider introducing deliberate, planned, or predictable elements alongside the random ones. Let's take a look at an example. What I have here is a snare and a hi-hat alternately randomly playing, which doesn't sound like much of anything. But if I introduce a constant element, we might have something. See what I mean? Marbles, by the way, also has a dedicated AI drum mode as well as a whole right side, which works like a souped up Turing machine. It's free on VCV Rack and certainly worth a look. If you want this kind of madness in non-modular form, check out Step Divider in Ableton's Probability pack. And yeah, you can set your own rates per lane and divisions. You can randomize everything. And it's up to you to make order out of this chaos, but I think you get the idea. Now let's get back to the Marbles patch. There are 2 more cool generative ideas hiding here aside from aligning predictability alongside randomness. The first is a simple clock divider. So what I did in this patch is just divide the trigger by 4 to get this kick, but any other division, like by 3 or 5 or anything else, might sound interesting as well. Now, not all generative setups have or need a fixed tempo, but if you have one, then tempo-synced LFOs by modules like Harmonaig or simple clock dividers can add really interesting variation to your patch, but at different rates and different intervals that are aligned and in sync with whatever's going on. The second useful generative idea in this patch is the probability gate in outputs T1 and T3. The idea is that based on a certain algorithm, either T1 or T3 is triggered. So let's hear what this sounds like. Notice that as I turn this bias knob, if I turn it all the way clockwise, you'll only hear hi-hats. And then as I turn it counterclockwise, the probability that you'll hear a snare increases all the way to just hearing snares. But the idea is that you can play this probability just like an instrument. Maybe make fills, right? Or use some sort of external modulator to move the bias knob for you. Now, this probability decision can lead to a simple outcome, as it is here, either a hi-hat or a snare being played, or to any other short or long subsequent chain of events that will follow either side of the coin toss. Say, for example, you can go on to play pattern A versus pattern B. On the DAW side, at least in Ableton, you can get similar results using follow actions. So the idea here is that you set a probability and then choose what happens when that probability occurs, and you can easily switch to the next pattern, first pattern, or any other pattern based on whether that probability occurs or not. Let's move on. Another interesting way to create evolving and interesting sequences from a few basic ingredients is to route several simple different length sequences into one. On the DAW side, this can be accomplished by routing 2 or more simple MIDI sequences to one instrument track. So let's take a look at this, for example. I've got a simple pattern here. It's 4 beats long, one note repeating itself. And if I take this pattern, which is a different note repeating itself after 13 steps rather than 4, something begins to happen, and then let's add another one, this time every 14 steps. And this is a great example of how polyrhythmic or polymetric patterns can create evolving music, even if they have just one note in them. Now the reason this works is because all these 3 tracks are routed to track 4, which in this case is my piano. If you want to implement this concept in a DAW-less environment, you may be able to take multiple MIDI tracks in your sequencer and send them to one MIDI channel destination, or use an external MIDI merge box. On the Eurorack side, I can use our good old friend the mixer here to achieve the same result. So for example, I could create a sequence here on Harmonaig, which would be, let's say, 7 notes long. You determine that with the axis parameter on the X channel, and then maybe 11 notes long on the Y channel, and then merge those outgoing gate events through a simple mixer. And this is a nice segue into another interesting generative tool, which is binary logic modules. Binary, as you may know, is simply zeros and ones, and the idea behind a binary logic module is that you feed it at least 2 sets of zeros and ones, and it will make a decision based on whether there's 0 or 1, or whether it's a high gate or low gate, and output either 0 or 1, which is the result of that decision. A mixer is really an example of a simple OR logic binary module. OR means that it will send out a high gate whether channel Y sends out a high gate, channel X sends out a high gate, or both. That's the meaning of the logic OR function. Now there are modules like Disting or dedicated logic modules which have different algorithms that choose whether a gate is produced or not. For example, an AND logic gate will only produce a trigger if both X and Y have a high gate signal. An XOR logic gate will produce a trigger only if one but not both X and Y are high. Disting has even more logic options like NAND, NOR, and XNOR, which become increasingly confusing, but I think the bottom line isn't the specific logic operation, but rather that these are interesting ways of combining 2 gates that will produce different results every time based on the logic used. Another generative idea I wanted to offer to you is to make safe bets, and I'll demonstrate this with Ableton's Melodic Probabiliy module in its probability pack. So let's take this simple melody for example. Right, nice, but it can get repetitive after a while. Now, I can shift its octaves, for example, but a safe bet would be maybe to shift an octave every now and then. Here. So a simple pattern can get a lot more interesting if we make a few safe bets here and there. If we want to take more risks, let's mess around with random velocity every now and then. Let's go crazy here. Right, so it's the same notes, but we have a little bit more going on with relatively few risks. Another safe bet is to just randomly not play notes in your sequence. The chance parameter in Electron's model samples works this way, as do trig conditions in sequencers like those found in other Electron instruments or the Deluge, for example, where you can change the probability of a specific step or all the steps in a sequence of occurring. Another nice example of safe bets in a DAW-less environment the spice parameter in MicroFreak. We'll mess with gates and triggers, and eventually pitch when you add some dice, but in a safe way, transposing octaves. And if timbre changes across octaves, then a nice side effect is timbre randomization. And if we gradually dial down the madness, you can see where we started. Okay, now this video is getting way too long as it is, and I only covered about half the ideas I wanted to. I'll show you a couple more things and then put the rest in my book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks available to people who support this channel on Patreon. I didn't want to get too carried away in this video if there is an interest, but if there is, let me know in the comments section and I'll make a follow-up part 2 to this video. So before we go, I wanted to talk about a few cool VCV rack modules, and then at the end, I'll walk you through the patch that I played in the intro to this video. So I reached out to my VCV rack guru, Omri Cohen, and asked him what his top generative VCV modules are, and he not only told me what they were, but also created 3 lovely patches around them. Here they are. NoteSec from JW Modules is a polyphonic grid-based sequencer with interesting randomization and grid manipulation functions, including a built-in game of life, and it's particularly useful for polyphonic generative patterns. Gray Code from Squinky Labs is an alternate take at the Turing Machine concept. Rather than shifting all the bits sideways when introducing a new random bit, it will randomize a different bit every time. The end result sounds different musically, and it also gives you access to each of the individual bits as an on-off gate, so you can sort of look at it as a random clock divider as well. Finally, there's a module called Generative from Amalgamated Harmonics, and it is, as its name implies, an interesting module for generative exploration. Rather than taking completely random numbers as an input, it lets you build your own complex waveform using a combination of an LFO, noise, FM, and AM, and then apply sampling probability to that as a source. Now I won't dig further into these patches here, but they'll be available on my Patreon for you to download if you like, and check out Omri's channel. It's an amazing resource for VCV rack and patching ideas in general. Okay, now let's take a look at how a lot of the ideas in this video work in this patch. For that, let's lower the level of all the 5 channels I use so that we can look at them one by one. Let's start simple. Everything is going into this stereo mixer by PanMix. We've got the 2 stereo arpeggio lines going into the left and right side out of rings, 1 panned hard left, 1 panned hard right. This is the bass line here. Then we've got these 2, I guess we can call them evolving drones, 1 panned left, 1 panned right. So those are the 5 or 4 elements in this patch, depending on how you want to look at it. The bass pattern is coming out of STO, then going into the VCA, then through LedRover for distortion, which I can control through here, and then just smack in the middle, not panned left or right. The actual bass line is the root note of the chord coming out of Harmonaig by Instruo. So we've got this cable here split out going into STO, which determines the bass. So you can follow along the bass here. And the notes that it's receiving are random notes coming in through here over the first channel in Ornament and Crime. Now this first of 3 channels in Ornament and Crime, you can select the channels using this little knob here, is just playing random semitones. It doesn't really matter because we're quantizing this anyway through Instruo. And if we scroll down, you can see that this is a Turing machine, and these are the limits, up and down, and it's set to go completely random, smack in the middle at 50%. 128 is 50%. If I want it to be a static melody, I'd lock it in going to 0, and if I want it to flip, I'd go all the way to 256. So that is the bass line, right? again played by the root note coming out of Harmonaig. And then Harmonaig is taking this root note and generating a chord out of it. And in this case, I'm not playing it polyphonically as a chord, but rather I'm using the boss bow tie to arpeggiate the chord coming through rings. Now, boss bow tie is a kind of special module. It's sort of like a sequential switch, but the steps are voltage controlled. And as you can see, it's sort of cycling through different groups or different subsets of steps as time goes by. So the 4 core notes of the chord are in these 4 steps of boss bow tie, but it's not always playing them. Sometimes it's playing only 1 or 2 notes of the arpeggiated chord, and the rest it's not doing anything. What determines this pattern, this cycling pattern through the various inputs of boss bow tie, is this cable coming out of Disting, which is a sum of 2 things. The first thing that Disting is mixing here is the voltage levels coming out of Quaid Megaslope, right? And right now it's set to a very simple 4-step sequence, but I could easily change the amount of steps to 5 or 3 or 2 or whatever I wanted. I'll stick to 4 in this patch. And then the second thing that it's summing is a random envelope coming out of the ADAC 506. So at the end of the day, the arpeggiated pattern is a combination of this envelope and then these voltages writing on top. Now, sometimes you won't hear anything because the voltage is spending most of its time in this part of boss bow tie, and the speed of the envelope changes every cycle randomly based on the stochastic random levels determined between these 2 minimum and maximum levels here. And the end result is this. Sometimes it'll arpeggiate all 4 notes, sometimes 1 or 2, sometimes none. Now the speed at which it goes down through here and the speed at which it goes back up is completely random every cycle based on the stochastic numbers generated here. So that's the baseline played through STO and the arpeggiated pattern played through rings. I also have an LFO coming into the brightness parameter coming all the way from hair mode over here. This is a simple slow sine LFO. Now the timing relationship between these 2 is determined by a simple clock coming out of hair mode. So if I stop it, you'll notice this stops, and also these notes, the basic core bass notes, stop changing as well. So what's going on in Quaid Megaslope is that as I run the pattern, right now I've got it set to a 4-step pattern. Every time this pattern completes, there is an end of cycle trigger that goes and generates another random note and shifts the entire chord and bass line in Harmonaig. So this is what it sounds like when there's a potential random shift every 4 steps on the arpeggio, and you're not hearing it, but you will soon as the cycle goes down here. But if I was to change this, say, to a 3-step sequence, right, then we'd get a shift in the bass note every 3 notes here, and it sounds very different from 4, obviously. I could move it obviously to 5 and change the order here any way that I wanted. Rings will play a different note every time there's a voltage change. The last element in this patch are these 2 notes, and these are actually quite simple sequences generated here in channel B and C. This one's transposed 2 octaves up. You can see the various ranges and probabilities here. Doesn't really matter, you adjust this to taste, and they're playing pentatonic minors on both, right? So the A channel is just semitones. I just need random numbers for the bass line, and here I'm keeping it simple in both channels to pentatonic minor. Now both these channels are controlled by stochastic envelopes. So this movement up and down the timing of this movement is completely random for every cycle based on these 2 channels of the 506. And in terms of level, they're going into the VCAs over here, and I'm taking the end of fall trigger whenever a cycle ends to not only obviously reset the randomness of the envelope, but also to potentially change a note using one of these two channels in Ornament and Crime. So that's basically the patch. We've got a filter being modulated here as well for both of these. QPAS stereo filter for make noise. The cutoff modulation is a simple sine wave LFO out of Harmonaig. So these two drone nodes don't need a clock, they'll just repeat every time they finish a cycle. If I turn on the clock in Harmonaig, the bass line and the arpeggio will gradually come in and start moving. The patch will feel a little bit different because we're playing a 5-note arpeggio this time around. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Like I said, there are quite a few more ideas in my book available to people who support this channel on Patreon. If you have any other generative tips or tricks, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. If you want to see a part 2 to this video, let me know as well. There's a bell to click after you hit subscribe to increase your odds of seeing the next one. Hit like if this was useful. Thanks for watching.